Today we have the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wikler. Thanks for coming back on.
It's great to be back with you, Brian.
So the big news out of Wisconsin is that Republican Ron Johnson announced that he'd be running for a third term in the Senate. So I guess my question is, would it have been more surprising if Ron Johnson didn't lie?
The answer is yes. This is a guy who promised not to run again in 2016 in order to get elected that year. He was like, this is my final term. I'm to and out. I'm a citizen legislator. But the next year, as soon as he was back in the Senate for his next second term, he went to bat, went to the mat, defied Donald Trump, refused to vote for Trump's giant tax giveaway to the ultra rich unless there was an extra tax giveaway piled on top of it that specifically benefited owners of the kind of corporation that Ron Johnson owns and his biggest campaign donors. And there's two billionaire Wisconsin families that put $20 million into Ron Johnson's 2016 campaign. Those two families walked away with more than $200 million in their first year because of the special Ron Johnson tax giveaway. And Johnson hasn't actually disclosed how much he personally benefited, but we know his net worth has doubled based on his disclosure forms. So he figured out that he could butter his own bread, and it's not in the slightest a surprise that he's running for another term to try to get more opportunities to do that at the expense of regular Wisconsinites.
Now, Johnson's one of the most beatable Republicans in the Senate. So does it actually help that he'll be the nominee versus someone more palatable for swing voters?
I mean, I will say in Wisconsin, you can never take anything for granted, and we have to expect an incredibly close and hard-fought election. That said, he is extraordinarily toxic. He's repelled, a giant fraction of the electorate already. His approval rating is like 36% in the last public poll. And that's a terrible place to be for someone running for their third term. So, there's a reason why 12 Democrats signed up to run against him. It's because they could smell the weakness in his political position, and also because they knew that Wisconsin needs, two senators who actually serve the people instead of just one, Tammy Baldwin. So, the Republicans have to throw everything they can into defending his seat because they need their seat to have a shot at getting a majority. But he's an albatross that's going to pull down Republicans across the state and galvanize Democrats to turn out in higher numbers.
Now, with that said, what's Johnson's biggest vulnerability heading into this election? What are you going to be focusing on over at Wisconsin Democrats?
So it's interesting. It's not what one might expect. There's been so much national attention on Ron Johnson pushing the most extreme COVID conspiracy theories and claiming that, the January 6th insurrection was done by fake Trump protesters and leftists dressed up as Trumpites. But that's actually not
people who dressed up like Trump and waved his flags and voted for him at the polling booth. And it's a long-term conspiracy theory. Yeah.
This is the long game. Clearly they're playing.
Yeah.
So this gotten him a ton of headlines. It's gotten him a ton of attention. But what's interesting is that his biggest vulnerability is actually the way that he's served himself at the expense of regular people. When you talk to voters who are generally cynical and disgusted with politicians, they know that he says all kinds of totally off the deep end things, but whatever, he's just talking. But when they hear that he has ripped them off, that he has given himself giant tax breaks at their expense and then tried to block support for them, did everything he could to block the child tax credit and the stimulus checks from going out, to block the support for small businesses in Wisconsin. He was the one guy at the end of the debate about the American Rescue Plan who did this emergency delay tactic to demand the public reading of this 600-page bill on the Senate floor just to stop families from getting their support for a few extra hours. He's just against most people, and he's in it for himself. And that, making sure everyone knows that as they walk into the voting booth, is the thing that will end his political career. So we've started that, and we're going to keep doing it all the way through the end of the election.
Switching gears a little bit, we're watching as people like Steve Bannon, for example, try to take charge of local election systems. That's obviously a priority for the far right. Are the election systems, as they stand in Wisconsin, secure? And what's at stake in the next election? How vulnerable is Wisconsin to a bunch of lunatics getting elected and then meddling?
Wisconsin is a state where 4 of the last 6 presidential elections came down to less than 1 percentage point. In 2020, we had 3.28 million voters. The Biden margin of victory was 20,682. I mean, it's a very small number. It's a couple people in every precinct.
Yeah.
And what that means is if there are people who don't believe in democracy working in every precinct and they turn away a couple of voters, that can tip a statewide election right there. So this
Yeah.
is a very, very serious threat. And it's the reason why we've, at the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, we've been pouring a ton of time into recruiting poll workers, into recruiting poll observers, into mapping out all the local elections that will affect election administration. We have a statewide day of local elections on April 5th. There are no statewide races that day, but there are races for mayor, there are races for judge, there are races for city council that set budgets for election administration, the people who appoint and confirm the municipal clerks who actually conduct the election. And those races will matter a ton in the fall for determining whether we have a free and fair election. Now, we have a tradition of, good, clean, well-administered elections. And 2020 went off extremely successfully in really tough conditions, but that could all get messed up. I mean, I'll give one example. The former Republican county chair in St. Croix County in western Wisconsin is like a full-on stop the steal guy. He wore a kind of a Knights Templar sweatshirt, which is a white supremacist symbol, at a public meeting, like on Zoom. And he was posting on their county party Facebook page that people needed to prepare for war, and people were responding about how they're going to bring their guns to, like political things. And it was such a scandal that he actually had to be kicked out of the party. He is now a poll worker in Hudson, Wisconsin. He's the party's submitted poll worker to show up at the polling place and determine whether people have proper identification. And you don't want that guy to be alone doing that job. So making sure that there are as many pro-democracy, I don't care what your politics are, but pro-democracy poll workers and people who are overseeing election administration is critical.
Now, is there any check to something like that? Like, there's going to be one of those guys at every polling place. Is there a way to make sure that, that 5,000 people wearing Biden shirts aren't just immediately turned back? Like, is there some check for something like that?
Sure. And I should say that you can't actually, in Wisconsin, you can't wear a Biden shirt into the polling place. But
yes,
there are a bunch of different checks. So the first thing is voter intimidation is a felony in Wisconsin. And we have an Attorney General, Josh Kaul, who's running for re-election, and we have to get him reelected, who, before the 2020 election, reminded people across the state that it is a felony that our state government takes very seriously to intimidate voters. So if there's a poll worker, if someone like this guy is intimidating voters who come in, having poll observers there who can flag this to our voter protection team and who can report it to law enforcement, it can put a stop to it. And that's, we can out-organize this attempt by the right to suppress the vote. The second thing is, in Hudson, Wisconsin, there was a member of the city council who saw that he had registered and objected. And what happened next is interesting, because he could be blocked as a poll worker, but other conservatives on the city council overrode the objection and then pushed back in. And I think that illustrates how having pro-democracy city councils really matters in small and medium-sized towns all over Wisconsin, as well as bigger cities. So that's when I look at the kind of slate of local officials in places like Appleton, Wisconsin. There's city council elections coming up on April 5th. It's just critical we do everything we can to elect people to those offices who believe in a system where everyone has an equal right to vote.
What are the consequences of failing to pass the voting rights bill in a state like Wisconsin? Is it going to have very little impact because we already have Democratic Governor Tony Evers acting as a check to Republican overreach? Like you tweeted about Plan B to save democracy. Can you tell me about those things?
So I'll first say federal legislation would make a huge difference. One piece of it is it would ban partisan gerrymandering. And boy, do we have partisan gerrymandering in Wisconsin. Our state Supreme Court is about to make final decisions on the electoral districts for the 2020, or I guess the next decade.
This is a Republican
control, exactly. Republican controlled state Supreme Court. And they announced that the basis for how they would consider proposed maps is they would look for the maps with the least changes to the previous maps. And the previous
Which were
maps,
also gerrymandered.
Also gerrymandered, exactly. So a federal law that would change that would be a huge gift to democracy in our state and states across the country. The other thing is that voting rights legislation that would involve, for example, a government kind of pre-clearance on any rule that would make it harder for people to vote and a review about the impact of it would provide a fail-safe in the event that Republicans get the governorship. because right now our Democratic governor vetoes all the bills that Republicans are passing, and boy, they're passing a lot of them that would make it harder for people to vote. But if we didn't have the governorship, it would be the federal government that we'd need. So, that kind of means that, if they find some other way to pass voting rights legislation over the course of this year, it'd be great. But if that doesn't happen, we have to reelect our governor. And Tony Evers, our Democratic governor, is rock solid on this. It's just totally unwavering. The Republican running for governor, Rebecca Kleefisch, has promised to sign all the bills that the legislature has sent and wants them to send more of them. And she was asked point blank if she would sign a law that allowed state legislators to overturn presidential election results. And she said it would be premature to comment. So, the threat is real. And winning these governor's races in Wisconsin and other states, the Secretary of State race is also incredibly important. This is Plan B, and we have to move all our chips onto it because time is short.
We look at a state like Virginia, where Democrats made a ton of progress in the last decade, passed popular legislation. That's also a purple state like Wisconsin, and yet we saw Republicans win out there. How is Wisconsin different? Like, what are you doing at the state party to make sure that your state isn't a repeat of Virginia in the midterms?
When I've talked to folks in Virginia, I think there's two big differences. One is a lot of folks will say they wish that they had ramped up the organizing earlier. And what we've done in Wisconsin is we never stopped doing it. So we've been running a continuous statewide organizing program since the spring of 2017. And we had a bigger organizing team at the end of last year in 2021 than we did in the fall of 2018. So we've been, we're in a hiring wave right now. Folks who want to join our organizing team should go to wisdems.org/jobs. If you want to fund us to help hire more organizers, go to the Don't Be a Mitch campaign and support us through that. But it makes a big difference to have a year-round program because you don't lose touch with the voters and with the volunteers who you need all the way through. The second piece is that in that race, I think there was a way that Glenn Youngkin kind of got control of the narrative and the conversation, especially around education. Wisconsin has a Democratic governor who was a lifelong educator. He was a teacher, a principal, a school superintendent. He was the superintendent of public instruction statewide. Under his leadership, our school system has gotten back in the top 10 public schools in the country after slipping significantly under the Scott Walker and Rebecca Kleefisch. That issue is not going to fall into the hands of Republicans here. And in 2021, we had a statewide election for the superintendent of public instruction. And Betsy DeVos's super PAC started running ads all over the state. Like the right went at it with messages like we saw in Virginia. But as the candidate endorsed by the Democrats won by 16 percentage points. And so you can see in the numbers that the way those issues are playing out here is different. The last thing I'll say is an opportunity which will only make a difference if we take advantage of it. And we are working to do that. And folks, tuning into this right now can help with that. In Wisconsin, you can request an absentee ballot for the entire year starting January 1st, which means that right now you can call voters in Wisconsin and tell them about this, and they can go on and click the buttons on the website and get their ballots locked in to be sent to them all the way through November. And in 2020, we had such a successful operation between the independent groups and the party to follow up with people who requested absentee ballots that 98% of them wound up voting. So, if you get on the list, we're pretty confident that you're going to cast a ballot. So that's the project. And that's something that there's never been a year in Wisconsin where so many people had already gotten into the system for absentee ballots the way that it happened in 2020. We can do essentially get out the vote like you'd normally do in the final 2 weeks of a campaign for 10 months. And that's a giant opportunity that we want to make full advantage of. And Republicans keep being against absentee ballots for no other reason than Trump was against them. So it gives us a kind of a potential edge over the GOP.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So anybody listening from Wisconsin, go and request that absentee ballot now. Make sure you get yourself on that list because I'm sure the Republicans would love nothing more than for November to roll around and that not to be able to work out. So as you mentioned, the state party, Wisconsin Democrats, is one of the beneficiaries of the Don't Be a Mitch Fund. It's also the only state party in the fund. And so I think that's a testament to, your leadership and how effective you and the rest of the organization have been since you took over. So Whether people donate as part of Don't Be a Mitch or if they donate directly to wisdems.org, and I'll put that link in the post description as well. What do these donations support? What are they doing right now? Where does their money go to?
The biggest part of our budget is organizing. And that means direct organizing staff, from our statewide organizing director to deputies to regional organizing directors to field organizers to paid organizing interns. We pay all our interns. It also means the operations staff to make sure that those folks all have laptops and health benefits. But that's the lion's share of our overall budget. It's a majority of where all our funds go, and it's the area where we can expand the most by hiring folks earlier or hiring more people. So that's a huge piece. We also, and something we've never done in a midterm before, we have organizers on our voter protection staff. So the voter protection team is doing phone banks in English and Spanish to recruit poll workers. And that has had the effect of radically, we recruited more poll workers last year for the 2022 election cycle than we did in the previous 5 years put together. And that operation has to succeed given what Republicans are trying to do. So
it's the most important thing right now.
Exactly. It's getting out the vote and protecting the vote so that people cast their ballots and then the ballots aren't thrown out.
Well, Ben, thank you, and to everybody you work with for what you're doing. Keep kicking ass in Wisconsin, because you guys have the luxury or or not the luxury, depending on how you look at it, of being on the knife's edge of all of these elections. So Wisconsin is always ground zero. Couldn't ask for somebody better to be running the show there. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.